it's Mo. It is July 12th, and I haven't started my July reading because I have started my July reading. I haven't started my July reading a wrap-up, which is a video that I do every month in which I tell you about the books that I've read throughout the month as close to when I've read them as I can. I always do this vlog style, and I just stitch all the clips together. It took me a while to start my reading, and then it took me a while to continue my reading, but now I have read quite a few books, so I want to talk about them. The first book that I read in July was Nemesis by Agatha Christie. I've just been in the mood for an Agatha Christie, and I've been reading the Miss Marple series. This, I think, is like the 11th or 12th book, and I think this is the second to last book in the series, and this one was fantastic. So I read The Caribbean Mystery and At Bertram's Hotel, which both are very Miss Marple heavy. Some of Miss Marple books, she's not in it very much. Some of them she uses like a proxy to do a lot of the investigating, but then she is in it in part. Some of it she comes onto the scene later once other people have kind of started investigating. But these three books, she's really in it. And in Nemesis, fantastic. One of my favorite Miss Marple books for sure. She's all over this book. She's doing so much. In Nemesis, Miss Marple actually brings up her time in The Caribbean Mystery and in At Bertram's Hotel because someone that she met on one of those trips tasks her to investigate a potential crime. She doesn't know what the crime was. She doesn't know what's going on. They just tell her that she needs to do this thing for them, and it intrigues her enough that she decides she wants to do it. So she does investigate this crime, figure out what it is, and meet many people along the way, some of them good, some of them bad, and of course Miss Marple prevails in her own way, at least. Sometimes Miss Marple's outcomes are not necessarily what's expected, but Miss Marple always roots out the evil, whatever that might be. So this was another great one. If you like Miss Marple, I wouldn't start here, partly because it's so far gone, but partly because I think you need the build-up. But I think you could start with The Caribbean Mystery, then do At Bertram's Hotel, then do this one, and it would make like a nice little trilogy. I think you should start in the beginning, although the first Miss Marple is a little bit weird and kind of different than any other Miss Marple, but I do think it's worth reading this entire series because this entire series is great. The next book that I finished in July is Whiteout by Greg Rucka and Steve Lieber. This is a graphic novel mystery thriller about a U.S. Marshal who's been banished to Antarctica. We do find out why. It's very violent. It's very graphically violent. It's not necessarily gory, and it is all these black and white illustrations, so, you know, it's not super horrific. So our U.S. Marshal main character has been banished to Antarctica. She's called out on a crime scene and she discovers that it's murder, and then she has to, with the help of other people on Antarctica, kind of deal with this murder and solve this murderer. Her superiors back in the US are not pleased with her, so they're not like super happy or willing to help her. She does have a few friends on the US base, and then she does have to travel to like the Australian base and the UK base and other places around Antarctica. And of course it's really super scary because it's like all super cold. So there's a couple of really thrilling moments in the cold and then some consequences of it being set in the cold as well. And I thought it would be perfect for Summerween. It is Summerween currently as I'm filming this, but I kind of just plan to read a lot of like mystery thrillers this month anyway. It's what I'm in the mood for. So this one fit in perfectly and I was super happy to have read it. There is another in this duology that follows the same characters but is a different crime. Here is a cover by Mike Mignola, one of my favorite artists. And I definitely will look out for that second Whiteout book because I thought this one was really good. I think this was also made into a movie as well. If you have the time, if you spot it, definitely recommend. The next book that I finished in July, also for Summerween, is We Need to Do Something by Max Booth III. I had heard about this horror, which is about a family who takes refuge in a bathroom with no windows during a potential catastrophic storm. We learn about this family, the family dynamics, the different aspects of the family's lives, and we slowly see them fall apart. So that sounds like a super interesting premise. Like, I think that sounds really fascinating interesting and could have been a really interesting psychological horror. It could have been a really interesting cosmic horror. It could have been a really interesting horror where we don't know what the horrific elements are. But this book was awful. It was so bad. I am shocked. I'm like genuinely surprised that this has gotten as much buzz as it has. It was not well written. It was not dynamic. It was not interesting. It was not scary. It was not horrific. I mean, there are elements that if you project your own fears onto, they could be scary. And I guess that is part of what all horror is us projecting our own fears onto the story. But this was just bad. I had heard a critique of this being that there's like a lot of scat talk, a lot of potty humor, a lot of bathroom talk, and there was, but honestly it didn't seem unjustified for the circumstances which this family found themselves in and the age of some of these family members. But like, that wasn't even the stupid part. There was so many other stupid parts. There was continuity issues with this. There was editing issues with this. There was, I mean, it was not good. It was so bad. So I don't recommend this book at all. I would say skip it. There's lots of other books, short horror books, that I would recommend. There's lots of other short horror books that I didn't like that I would say you should read over this, but don't read this one. The next book that I finished in July is The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. This is the second in the Vampire Chronicles, and this is a reread for me. I did reread Interview with a Vampire at some point during my booktube career, and I had always intended to move on with The Vampire Lestat. I was in the mood to read this, so I decided to pick it up. This one is my old copy from the 90s. It is falling apart, obviously. I was surprised that I did not remember this, like, at all. I remembered a little bit of the very beginning and a little bit of some of Lestat's history. If you are unfamiliar with Vampire Chronicles and Interview with the Vampire, I would highly recommend reading Interview with a Vampire, first and foremost. That's a great book. And that book follows Lestat and Louis as they navigate being vampires, and as Louis loses his humanity to Lestat and becomes a vampire, his thoughts on that, his reconciliation of his human nature and his vampire nature, and wanting to learn more about vampire lore, about vampire life, about vampire families and communities and relationships. And we see it all from Louis' eyes as he is writing a book. He's being interviewed. It is an interview with a vampire. So that one's great. It has a lot to say about vampire myth. It definitely is now a modern classic. I'm sure all of these are to a certain extent. And it definitely does continue the vampire lore that was created with Carmilla and Dracula and the vampire and other things like that, and bring it into a more modern day. That book was written, I think, in the 60s or 70s. This one was definitely written in the early 80s. In The Vampire Lestat, we see Lestat telling his story. And I love that device. I love the idea that they are both like books within books. I don't think that's continued in the rest of the series, but I would love to see it if it was, because I think that's a really interesting literary device and an interesting way to get all the history in. So we see Lestat after the events of Interview with the Vampire, and then he tells us his story from the beginning of his life. So we see him in the beginning telling the story, and then at the end we see the present day again. His version of events definitely differs from Louis' version, which I think goes a long way to like hammer home that human aspect of these vampires. But this one is so bogged down in the history of vampires, in the history of the world, in the history of supernatural beings, and it really takes like a huge middle chunk to explain that and go through it. And we meet a lot of other characters, some of whom we've met in Interview with the Vampire, some who are going to be pivotal in next books, and some who we've only heard tell of, and we get their stories as well. So Lestat tells us a story that as it was told to him by Armand and of other people. So it's like a lot going on, and then there's this huge long like history, ancient history kind of aspect to it, and it's so boring. Like, I remember parts of Interview with the Vampire being slow and contemplative and philosophical, I guess you could say, but this one was just like, it had so many boring parts, but it's totally balanced by some of the exciting parts and getting to know Lestat and getting to know the different people that we've either met before or the new people that we're meeting. So even though I think this book could have been cut way down and the explanations of the history of vampires been cut way down and edited way down, overall, I really enjoyed the book. There was just times where it dragged. I mean, it took me like a month to read this book. You know, it took me a long time to get through, but it was worth it in the end, and I am excited to move on to Queen of the Damned. There was definitely a part, like, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through the book where I was like, I am not going to move on with this series. Like, I can't do this again. By the end, I was like, yeah, I am definitely going to read Queen of the Damned. So I will be continuing on the series, probably not anytime very, very soon, just because it does take a lot to read it. The next book that I finished in July is How to Pronounce Knife by Souvankham Thammovongsa. This is a collection of short stories by a Laotian Canadian author, and this was my TBR spin pick for June. So I did finish this in July, and I will have a whole reading vlog about this out at some point. These stories are all from kind of the immigrant perspective or the children of immigrant perspective, and they all have to do with connections to your heritage, lack of connection with where you're currently living, the changes that have to go on when you move to a new country, the excitement that you feel at any point when you might kind of sort of fit in at this new country, the grasping for connection that people feel either to hold on to what they knew before or to become part of what they are currently in, the situation that they're currently in. And then I think at the heart of every single one of these stories is connection with people, either how you connect to your family, how you connect to strangers, how you are othered by strangers, which is a lack of connection or a form of connection. The things that people of color have to deal with every day, and then specifically immigrants, people who don't speak the language as their first language, people who don't understand the customs, and the connections that you might form or might be severed because of all that stuff going on in your life. So I thought this one was really interesting. I really liked it. These were all very quiet. These were all very realistic. You know, there wasn't speculative elements to these. There wasn't big revelations to these, but they all felt very whole. You know, if you watch this channel, that I don't love short stories that feel like they were just thrown together or feel like they were just drafts. I like stories that feel like whole stories, and these definitely felt this way, and they all felt like complete. There might not have been a big revelation or a big twist in any of these stories, but they all felt very complete and satisfying when you were done reading them. So I definitely can't wait to read more from this author, and I would definitely highly recommend. The next book that I finished in July is MIddlegame by Seanan McGuire. This is the fourth Seanan McGuire book that I've read this year, which is crazy. Sometimes I don't read 4 books by a single author for years, and this year I've read 4 Seanan McGuire books. This is the start of a series about alchemy and about a past alchemist's or several past alchemists' idea for the world and their hope for world domination or for power or for saving the world, etc., etc. MIddlegame follows Roger and Dodger, who are twins who are separated by their creators and sent to different families. And really this whole story, over 500 pages. I read 2 over 500 page books this month, which is crazy. I haven't read a over 500 page book in years. I think. I might have read one last year. What was I saying? This whole 500 page story is really about Roger and Dodger connecting and making a connection and rekindling the connection that they've always had since birth. It follows them throughout time, and this book does have time changes. It does have different timelines. It does have time resets where they come together, where they break apart, why these things happen, how they are connected, and how their connection is integral and important to the world. This book also has a book within a book. In that book, which is a children's story written by A. Deborah Baker, she is actually an alchemist, and the books that she wrote, these children's books that she wrote, are actually like foretelling the story for other alchemists and trying to get people on her quest, her alchemist quest. Like, I don't exactly understand, even after reading this book, if A. Deborah Baker is like a good character or a bad character, if she was for good or for evil, but I think we will find out more about that in the rest of the series. And actually, those books that A. Deborah Baker wrote are a series that exists of 4 books. So I think we're going to have 4 books in this series as well that kind of correspond to those 4 books, which I think is called In the Up and Under is the series. This book does have many different sections, like I said, and in some of the sections we get excerpts from Over the Woodward Wall by A. Deborah Baker, and within the story we realize that other people, other alchemists were doing this as well. So Frank L. Baum and some other authors were also writing stories that were connected to their work as alchemists and had impact on the rest of the world, which I thought was an interesting little aside. This book also talks so much about John Wyndham's The Midwich Cuckoos, which I love John Wyndham. He is kind of a forgotten modern classic sci-fi writer from Britain. I've only read 2 of his books, The Day of the Trifid and, oh my god, the other one that was the first one that I read that I loved, and now I can't think of what it's called, but I really, really love his books. I have a couple of his books. I don't have The Midwich Cuckoos, which is the book that's talked about in this book, but it made me really, really want to read it. So I'm going to have to try and find either an audio copy or a physical copy of that, like ASAP, so that I can see the connections that were made in this book. I enjoyed this. I think it was a little long. I think it was a little repetitive. I think we could have cut some of that out. I understand the reasons why it was the length that it was, but I think it could have been a little quicker, a little more concise. But I really enjoyed it. I will go on to read the next one. I've heard that the next one in the series is not as good because they don't follow all the same people, so we're not following Roger and Dodger in the next one, and I know a lot of people don't like that. I might like that. I think it's going to depend on the characters, and if I like the characters, if I then continue on to the next book. Or maybe I'll be so curious about who the next people are in the 3rd book that I will just continue on. So those are the first 6 books that I read in July, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is August already, and I really didn't get to talk to you about any books after MIddlegame. It's time to finish up the books and do our wrap-up of the wrap-up. The next book that I finished in July was Eartheater by Dolores Reyes. I was looking for a horror for Summerween, and I was looking for a translated work, so this was absolutely perfect. I got this one earlier this year. This is about a young girl who, when her mother dies, when she is very young, like a child, she starts to eat earth and have this uncontrollable urge to eat earth. How that impacts her life and how her mother's death impacts her life. This book reminded me of Goddess of Filth by V. Castro in a lot of ways, because it is about like women finding their power, whether that's like a magical power or whether that is the connection that they have to each other, the connection that they have to people, the connection in this case that our main character has to the earth. I don't remember if our main character is named or not, and on the back it does say that this takes place in Argentina. So we see this woman dealing with grief and loss, and as she grows up, how those things manifest in her, those things change in her, and how her earth-eating tendencies become abilities that other people seek out in her as well, and why that might be. What those abilities and what that cultural significance is, and how people view that, and how she views herself. And I guess it's about like how girls and women and the grief and the power that's held within their grief, how they utilize that power, whether they utilize it for good or to the detriment of themselves, or maybe some of both. So I did like this one. I didn't think it was very horrific. There was a lot of vignettes of horrible things happening, and there was, by the nature of this, lots of stories of different people that have realistic horror elements, like things that could actually happen to people, framed within kind of a mystical or traditional medicine, traditional magic kind of frame. It didn't feel completely like revolutionary. The horror wasn't pushed that far to make it a super fantastic horror book. The themes weren't pushed that far to make it a outstanding book of its ilk. But I would say if you've read Goddess of Filth and you're looking for something similar, it's not the same story, certainly. There's a lot of differences, but it feels similar. And again, having to do with this Latin American, in this case Argentinian, in that case Mexican, themes of magic and mysticism, like within religion in some ways, but manifesting in potentially supernatural kind of ways. I would definitely say check it out. And I would love to read more by Dolores Reyes. This definitely has very like short, clipped language. It also kind of reminded me of books where we see young women growing up throughout time. I've read quite a few of those since being on BookTube, and some of them work for me and some of them don't. I think this one definitely did. I think not lingering on our main character's childhood is helpful. And I also think that this book is similar to a lot of books that I've read in those like little glimpses of people's lives. Even The Sentence, which I read last month, kind of gives you like little glimpses into people's lives and how our main character in both these stories come in and out of people's lives and affect their lives. So that also is an aspect in here, and I enjoyed it. And I will read more by that author. I just don't think it was like a groundbreaking novel for me particularly. Perfume, The Story of a Murderer by Patrick Suskind. This is translated from the German by John E. Woods. Oh, I meant to say that Eartheater is translated from the Spanish by Julia Sanches. Now, I'd heard a lot about Perfume. There was a movie made of this. I heard it was this really intense horror about a person who had an amazing sense of smell and decided that he wanted to make perfume of people, and he went around murdering people. And I think that that's like how it's pitched. And a couple things that I didn't understand with this, like I knew it took place in Paris. That's one of the reasons that I didn't read it at the same time as I was reading The Vampire Lestat, because that takes place so much in Paris as well. But I didn't realize that it was so long ago. I think this is set in like the 18th century, so the 1700s. I didn't realize that this is very silly. It's very much a satire of a murderer story. It's very comedic and obtuse and bizarre in its humor. We see our main character, who is born with an amazing sense of smell, but no actual physical smell himself, being born to a woman like in the street. She's like a fishmonger or something, and she's like in the street and she just squats down and has the baby. It's like a lot about like squalor and disgusting things, disgusting smells, how our main character, because he can smell so much, is disgusted by so much, and how Paris is like completely disgusting. But we follow little bits of different people, and we see their little stories sometimes. So he'll meet someone and have an interaction with them, and then the book will kind of continue on with their story a little bit, and we'll hear the end of their story. It's like very small, and the main story is obviously about our main character, who does eventually murder someone. I don't think that's a spoiler because it's in the title, but it's not as like serious and horrific and like severe as I thought it was going to be. It's very silly, it's very tongue-in-cheek, it's very comedic, and I enjoyed it. It's certainly purple prose, it's definitely very lyrical, it's very much Gilded Age kind of style of atmosphere and language, and the way that everything is like talked about, the different accents that people have, the different levels of aristocracy that we deal with, the different levels of poverty. Everyone from every aspect of life is kind of represented in this like very flowery lyrical way, which makes it like a little bit tough to read. I did read this one on audio. I thought the audio was really good. I don't think I could have gotten through this without the audio, honestly. I think I would have really struggled, especially having just read The Vampire Lestat and having that kind of intense flowery language in another book. This book just wasn't what I thought it was. I think you need to know going in that this is a parody, that this is a satire, that this is over the top and silly in a lot of ways, but also gruesome, also gross, also disgusting. I think I liked it overall. I definitely had a certain expectation of it that I had to readjust my thinking. I had to readjust what I was hoping for out of this. But once I did, I liked it, and I do think that there are some shocking moments and some surprising moments. Something that I really liked about this book is the talk about perfume and how to make perfume, the idea of perfume and what it was used for, but also how it's created. I think that reading Jitterbug Perfume by Tom Robbins when I was little and loving that book, it's definitely probably in my top 10 favorite books of all time. I have a fondness for perfume in books and perfume making in books, and also I guess my fondness for the service industry and the idea of creating something and it being a service to someone definitely comes up in this book as well. So I would say give it a shot, but know that it is not the heavy horror. I was picturing it to be more like Silence of the Lambs or something, and it's definitely not like that. The next book that I finished in July is Graveyard Shift by M.L. Rio. This book also bucked my expectation, but in a good way, because I had heard really mediocre things about this. A couple people, I think Riley Marie liked this one, but most people really, really didn't like this one. But one thing that I think should absolutely be known about this book is that it ends like 20 pages, 30 pages before the end of this book. So there's a lot of subsequent material in this edition. Maybe not all editions. This is like a Barnes & Noble edition, but in this edition there's a lot of extra pages because I really thought I had 25 more pages to go. So one of the things that shocked me about this book was that it ended and I was like, oh, I didn't think it was going to end. It's not that it necessarily ended badly or abruptly. I just was expecting by the actual physicality of the book to be reading more. Graveyard Shift is about a group of people. They're not so much friends, but as we learn more about them, we find that they kind of are friends and they are connected. But they're a group of people who meet on campus at sort of like an Ivy League school, sprawling campus. There's one place which happens to be like in the shadow of a graveyard that you can still smoke. All these people come from all their different respective places to smoke on campus, especially late at night, and they all meet up. So we have one person who works in the local campus bar who had been taking classes but doesn't take classes anymore. We have one person who is a fungus, what is that called? Micrologist or whatever, someone studying biology and fungus. We have one person who is now like a PA. We have one person who we're not sure about. Oh, we have one person that's a journalist. That's important. They all happen to be there one night. So we're put in this story not really understanding the relationships of all these people, but we find out as the story goes on, which I thought was great and I really loved, and I liked the way the information was doled out. But they all witness something that they think is odd, and some of them pursue it more heavily than others, but it entangles the entire group. And this kind of family, this friendship group that they didn't even know that they were friends, that we didn't even know that they were friends, come together in like a very specific way with a very specific goal. It is a very nebulous story in some ways. I would say that most people would think that it has a unsatisfying ending, but I actually really loved the ending, and I really loved the book in general. I loved the way M.L. Rio wrote. Like I said, I loved the way the connections were made between people. I loved the way the information was doled out, the way we were learning how to understand those relationships. So I just really, really liked it. I've always been interested in We Were Villains, but it struck me as a little bit of a young book, and this one, also being kind of a dark academia book, made me think that I will like that one a lot more, and I definitely want to get to any other novellas that M.L. Rio has. I know they just put out Hot Wax, so I'm interested to get to that one. I just really, really liked it, and you can add it to a mushroom book, a fungus book, so I think I'm going to do a video soon about all the fungus books I've read, and maybe ranking them fungus wise, like out of 5 mushrooms or something, because I think they're all really interesting. I also think this cover is really beautiful. It was perfect to read for Summerween and Noir July because it was creepy in parts and it was like disturbing in parts. It's so short too, that's the thing. Like, because there's all that additional material, it's only like 108 pages. So I would definitely suggest picking this up or grabbing it on audio. I didn't read this one on audio, I read this one physically, but the audio I'm sure is only like an hour, so I would definitely highly recommend. The next book that I read in July is another translated work, and this is The Master Key by Masako Tagawa, translated from the Japanese by Simon Grove. I've had this one on my radar for a long time, and I was super happy to find it, I think earlier this year. I really like this one. It is interesting because it was written quite a while ago. It was written in 1962, so yes, quite a while ago, but only more recently translated. But it definitely has that current Japanese and Korean kind of writing tradition of following different people. Oh, that's kind of a theme this month, which I didn't even really realize. But we're following many different women in a apartment building for older single women. So this is an apartment building that was created for women who are unmarried and who are living alone, who are getting older in life. Like, some of them are younger, but they're mostly, you know, in their 40s, 50s, like getting to that spinster age, and some of them even older. Some of them are working, some of them are on pensions, some of them are finding other ways to survive. And this apartment building, we learn, is going to be moved by the city. So they need to put a road or something in, and the whole building is going to get shifted. And we find out right in the beginning of this book, before they can shift the building, they find a body. So then we're looking at each person out of this group of people in the apartment building, leading up to this moving of the building and leading up to this discovery of the body and figuring out what they were doing. And each of them have their own secrets. Each of them have their own lives that they led. Each of them are connected to each other in some way. And it reminds me a lot of The Full Moon Cafe or Before the Coffee Gets Cold or any of those more modern Japanese books where each woman is kind of teaching you a lesson, but the lessons are not like sweet and good and nice. So it's interesting to me that that kind of very cozy style of book, which is very popular right now, is kind of a tradition in Japanese literature, but not always necessarily in that cozy, warm-hearted, good-spirited kind of way. This apartment building has a master key, and so the master key comes in and out of these different women's lives and how they choose to utilize the master key to get into different various places in this apartment building. Something that this book does do, which I think is a little weird, is it kind of has a like conclusion where many things are revealed to you that you would not have necessarily known. There are clues throughout the book that you might have been able to piece together as like something, but not necessarily the conclusion of this book, not necessarily the conclusion of this mystery. So it's a little bit of like a cheat, which I know some mystery readers don't like. At the end, everything's kind of explained to you. And actually, I kind of think it's worth knowing that going into it, because I think I would have thought about it a little differently if I had known that. But I really enjoyed it. I liked the different characters. There's a lot of stereotypes. There's a lot of negative connotations of older women that are held in Japanese beliefs. And there's a lot of like fat shaming, elder shaming, and the uselessness of a woman who's not married, or any of those bad stereotypes that are perpetuated by Japanese culture. At this time, I see it a lot in Japanese books that I read. I don't know if it's still perpetuated that way, except the fat shaming. That seems to be always like a problem in Japanese culture. So there is that, but you do have to take it with a grain of salt and know what you're getting into and know that you're reading a book from Japan that was set in the 60s. I figured that Masako Tagawa was a female author because of her name, but I looked her up on Wikipedia and she was actually a really interesting person and had a really interesting life, and she ran a lesbian like club. She she was a fascinating character, and that's something else that I might suggest doing is like looking her up, because it puts a lot of what happens in this book into a different context, knowing her actual background and knowing her maybe political leanings or sexual leanings or things like that. So I thought it was really interesting. I really want to read more from her. It says on the back that there is another book called The Lady Killer, and I think she also wrote a couple of other books that are not yet translated into English. I could see myself rereading this one. It reminded me a lot of Yoko Agawa's Revenge, which is a collection of intertwined and interconnected short stories. This is definitely more of a full actual novel. That one is much more individual short stories that all have something to do with each other. I like that one a lot more. I thought that one was incredible, amazing, fantastic. I enjoyed this one fine. It did remind me of it in certain aspects, and it definitely made me want to read Revenge again. Next we have Crackpot, The Obsessions of John Waters, which is a nonfiction collection of essays written by the film director and celebrity John Waters, the personality John Waters. I have seen some of John Waters' movies. He made a lot of movies in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and I'm sure 2000s and 2010s and 2020s maybe even, but he is from Baltimore, he's queer, and if you don't know his work is known for being like very volatile, very disgusting. He's most famous for working with Divine, who was I'm not sure if she was transgender or just a drag queen, but she was known for being like big, fat, disgusting, gross, revolting, violent, angry, etc., etc. But one of my favorite movies of his is Polyester, where she plays like a very trad wife, traditional housewife in suburban Baltimore. So he's known for like very gross things and sexual and deviant and gay and whatever else you can think of if you haven't heard of John Waters before. I think his most famous is probably Desperate Living or Hairspray. He's really known for doing Hairspray, the movie. I love, like I said, Polyester. Pecker is another movie that I really enjoy by him. Those are, I think, more like on the tame side. I've known about John Waters for a long time. He's an amazing queer figure. I've never read any of his writing, and these are essays that were collected from various places that he had written them from 1983 to 1986. It was published in 1987. John Waters is a lot no matter what. That's kind of his thing, but these were just so exhausting. He's always on in every one of these essays, pretty much. He's always doing a shtick. He's always talking direct to reader. He's always informing the reader in a way that is like educational and instructive. He's always talking to you like, do this, do this, do this. And I found them to be exhausting. This teeny tiny book of only like 12 essays took me like a month to read. I really struggled to get through it. I enjoyed some of the things that were in here. He has a couple of essays called Hatchet Piece, 101 Things I Hate, and then Puff Piece, 101 Things That I Love. And it's like just things throughout his day that he hates and then loves. And they get more like insane and more bizarre and more, over the top. Maybe it's just that he steps on chewing gum and he hates that, but maybe it's even more political or sexual or whatever. One that I really, really did love actually was called Going to Jail, and it is about him running a film program, a film class in jail, and talking about his movies and actually dealing with prisoners and talking to prisoners. He is obsessed with celebrity murderers like the Manson family and people like that, which is not my thing. I find that to be pretty repulsive and repugnant, and especially the fascination with it to be an issue. It definitely makes sense here, and I totally understand it, but it's not something that I want to talk about or converse with people about or learn more about necessarily. But hearing it from that perspective of then talking to actual prisoners, talking to actual people who have committed crimes, and his thoughts on them felt like the most genuine, the most from the heart essay that he had in here. I mean, there's definitely still some over the top aspects to that essay, and some things that it's hard to tell whether they're actually happened or are true or his embellishments, but it definitely felt much more like a genuine conversation with this person and hearing their genuine thoughts on things. So overall, I'm glad that I read it. It was not for me, even though I enjoy him as a person, and I'm so glad he's around. I'm so glad that he's making the content that he makes and the art that he makes and the writing that he makes. I don't think I would read much more of his just because it is exhausting. But if you love his humor or you want to know more about his humor, I would definitely check it out. Next, I read my TBR spin book for July, I believe, which was Cain by Jean Toomer. I have 2 copies of this one. I read this book on audio. It is very, very short. It's only 115 pages. Cain, the title, references sugarcane, and everything in this book kind of revolves around sugarcane or has something to do with sugarcane, and it's mostly set either in the very end of slavery or around the time of the freedmen and when enslaved people were freed in America. And it follows lots of people's different stories. So we have the name of a person or the name of a place, and then a few pages up to a lot of pages about those people, that story, what is going on, and how it kind of touches upon sugarcane and the idea of sugarcane. And then in some places we have songs, we have poems. A lot of the stories have repetitive stanzas of songs or poems within them, and then we see that reprised throughout the story. Some of them have longer poems. Some of those poems are standalone. Some of them have to do with the actual stories. Sometimes we're talking about children's songs. Sometimes we're just talking about repetitive stanzas within the story that people are speaking. It reminded me a lot of a book that I read. It was by a poet laureate in Washington, D.C., The Woman Standing Singing on the Corner or something like that. I talk about it more in my TBR Spin vlog, so definitely check that one out. But idea of biblical verses, of mythology coming into it, of ring shout kind of idea, and the idea of repeating things. It also reminded me a lot of Nawal al-Saadawi's Woman at Point Zero, which has a very repetitive nature where the same lines are repeated, and it's almost like an oral tradition, like a poem handed down, like you would be orally speaking these stories of these different people to your children, to the community. So I really, really liked it. I thought it was really interesting. The stories are mainly focused on the relationship between men and women, but they definitely have aspects of being freed slaves, of being free people, of working for white people, of oppression from white people. And although they are set in that early time, and although this was written, I think in the 20s, yes, copyright 1923, it is relevant today to the Black experience and to the way that society looks at Black people in America. And I think it's definitely a pivotal Black American writing. I think the poetic aspect reminds me a lot of how the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of the people writing at that time in that place were using poetry, not necessarily within their stories, but alongside their stories, whereas this uses it within. It was written right around the same time. It's an interesting juxtaposition to Harlem, New York, people writing like Nella Larson about more high society, this talking about kind of the lower classes. Really, really interesting, really fascinating. I really, really enjoyed it. I could definitely see myself rereading this. I'd like to reread it physically because reading it on audio, even though I was looking at the physical copy a lot of the time, it was hard to tell where those kind of poetic elements were and where those repeating stanzas were and where that poetry came into it. So I think it would be interesting to read this physically. Highly, highly recommend. Definitely going in my Black American history oeuvre. The next book that I finished finished in July is Death of an Ex. Although this fits into July Noir and Summerween, I also read this for PI July. This is actually the only book that I got to read for PI July, sadly. What a great concept for a readathon. What a great idea for a readathon. I love it so much. Death of an Ex by Adelia C. Pitts is the second in the Vandy Myrick mystery series. Vandy Myrick is a kind of disgraced cop. She was a cop in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Delia C. Pitts is a New Jersey author. And Vandy, short for Evander, she was named after her father. She had an incident in her police career and in her life that have caused her to change the trajectory of her life and become a PI, a private investigator. And luckily, her BFF is a lawyer, and so she kind of takes her under her wing and helps her start her PI business. We see the relationship to her best friend and her best friend's wife. We see her relationship to some men in her life. And in the first book, we see why Vandy's life changed so drastically and what caused this, and how, even though she is doing a good job being a PI, righting wrongs, helping people, she's also in this really self-destructive place in her life. And there's a whole big mystery that has to get solved, all in New Jersey, in Queenstown, New Jersey, which the first book I think is called Mystery in Queenstown or something like that. In the second book, we see that everything that we learned in the first book is still lingering with Vandy, and she actually runs into her ex-husband, her baby daddy, and what this does to kind of change, once again, a little bit the trajectory of her life. And I think this one was a little weaker in the character development than the first one, because I do think that Vandy does some things in the beginning of this book regarding her ex-husband that seemed out of character even for her. She is in a self-destructive place. She is in a bad place in a lot of ways, but she's also doing a lot of things like staying sober and keeping commitments that she has made to be in a better place, if not for her, then for the memory of some of the people that she's lost. So there's a couple things that happens in the beginning of this book that I'm like, that seems like a device to make this happen, as opposed to true to Vandy and true to Vandy's character. So I struggle with that a little bit, and I struggled to get into this one, but once we got more into the heart of the mystery, and once people start dying and things start happening, it's just a fun book. I really love Delia C. Pitts's modern noir style. It reminds me a little of Sarah Gran, but not in a cosmic woo-woo way, more in just the short staccato sentences and the homage to more traditional noir writers. And I just think that her books are really engaging and fun. Not the greatest of all mysteries, but again, it's more about the characters and the interactions with the characters that you want to see. And you did definitely want to see the resolution of this mystery, but more you want to see how Vandy was going to come through it. You wanted to see what was going to happen to her and where she's going to end up in the third of the series. I assume that this series is going to go on, and I hope it goes on. I like that there's so much reference to New Jersey and various places in New Jersey. There's a lot of love for New Jersey in these books, for sure. Her other series, which I've only read one of, is set in Harlem, so it's much more love of New York, which is also great, but the New Jersey aspect is definitely something that keeps me coming back. I think it's better to read the first book first so you know what's going on with Vandy's life. The next book that I finished in July is a long time coming. It is The Lottery and Other Stories by Shirley Jackson. I started this in January of 2024. It is a lot of short stories. I started it for Winterween of that year, and then I read some for Summerween of that year, and then I was going to read some for Winterween this year, and I never did. And then I decided I really wanted to finish it. I only had 6 or 7 stories left. I did have most of the longer ones left, but I did also have the titular story, The Lottery, which I had read before in high school and probably since high school as well. So I knew what that story was. I knew what the upshot of that story was, but I didn't remember the exact specifics of it. So it was good to read it again. I think it was probably overall the most shocking, full punch at the end horror story in here. But the amazing thing about all these short stories is they all had this like very unsettling, very off-kilter, very off-putting tone to them. And so even if they were very, very short, even if they were more about social horrors and social justice horrors, even if they were more about the horrors of being a housewife, if they were more about the horrors of anxiety, they were all visceral in some way. They all creeped you out in some way, even if they weren't like strictly scary horror, like murder horror. I liked The Intoxicated, which I think was the first one. That's very short, like 2 pages. I liked My Life with H.R. Macy, which was like not horror necessarily, but like retail horror, which I do enjoy. Now I'm not going to remember what it was called because I read them so out of order, but there was one that was about a woman who moves into a town, and it's told from like one of her neighbors' perspectives, and it's about how the neighbor is really excited to meet this new woman, get to know her, and I'm sure she's a very, very suitable woman. And then the newcomer makes friends with like a black person, and then obviously like the whole town is going to shun her. So it's interesting that Shirley Jackson was writing about those kind of race relations, that she was writing about the horrors of housewives and the horrors of domestic life. It was interesting that she was writing about the social horrors and how society is scary, and a lot of these stories had to do with that. They were written between 1948 and 1949. Now, I don't know if they were written, but they were published. This does have an introduction by a horror writer that I've never read from, A.M. Holmes, but of course I didn't read that. I just skipped it. One of the later ones that I read I really liked, which was about a wife who goes to the city, and she's so excited to go to the city on vacation with her husband, and her husband goes off to do some like business, and her anxiety kind of takes over. How she at first is so enamored of the city and everything's so glamorous and everything's so exciting, but the more her anxiety comes into play, the more she sees the cracks in the sidewalk and the plaster falling and the buildings being old and traffic being scary. You could feel your anxiety like ramping up along with this woman, and you could see how anxiety takes over, and all those details that you have seen before and you don't care about when you're not anxious become horrible, debilitating, anxiety-producing things. So yeah, I really, really loved this collection. I thought it was really interesting. There's tons of different ones. I do think it was too long. I think like if I had had 2 collections of half this many short stories, I would remember more of them, and I would maybe be more inclined to like linger over them. Because this was so long, I was like, okay, we have to get through it. It still took me a year and a half to read, you know what I mean? But I love Shirley Jackson's writing. I do think she has this amazing capability to draw you into a story and to make you feel things, like visceral nature of stories, and to hold you with that story. And sometimes you don't even know what the story signified or what the finished product of the story is, but you find yourself thinking about it later, or you find yourself being unsettled by it. I don't think all of these stories were fully complete. I've talked about this a lot lately, where some short stories feel incomplete, some short stories feel like drafts, and I don't like stories like that. I do like stories that seem very well-rounded, very well thought out, maybe have a punch at the end, but do have like a full circle moment of finality to them. I don't think Shirley Jackson falls into either category. None of these felt unfinished. None of them felt like drafts. They all felt like practiced work, but some of them just ended. Some of them didn't have a punchline. Some of them didn't have a resolution. It's somewhere in between, but they were all very satisfying. Definitely highly recommend Shirley Jackson in general. My favorite is still We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and I definitely want to reread that one at some point. The next book that I finished in July was a reread for me, and that was The Murders of Molly Southbourne. I recently found the 3rd in the Molly Southbourne trilogy, and I've been wanting to revisit this one for a long time. I read this one on audio. I actually gave my physical copy to a friend, and I don't know what happened to it. I don't think I'm getting it back, which is fine. It just means that I have to find another physical copy, because I love this book. It was my favorite book of the year that I read it, maybe 2021, a long time ago. I haven't read it in a long time because I loved it so much. It was interesting to read it on audio. I definitely think I liked it more physically, reading it physically, because you felt more cocooned by it. You felt more trapped by it. And one of the things about Molly Southbourne is that for a lot of this book, she is trapped. So Molly Southbourne is a young girl. We meet her as a very little girl living with her parents on a farm. And very quickly we find out that Molly is different, that her parents have to help her with certain things, and she needs to follow these rules that are set out by her parents. And as she grows up and as more things happen to Molly, we find out that her situation is even more volatile than we originally thought, and that Molly originally thought, and Molly is taught even more strictly by her parents to do certain things, to avoid certain things, to listen to them, to follow these rules, and these rules become ingrained in Molly. Because Molly is kept so isolated, because she is kept so separately, she obviously grows up very differently. But like every teenager, she's going to disobey her parents at some time, but the consequences of these indiscretions by Molly are very, very serious. So we follow Molly as she grows up, as she has her rebellious side, and as she eventually moves out of the farm, moves on with the knowledge that she has to like become more of an adult, and what happens then. But this story is so crazy and interesting, and I think it's worth going in totally blind. It's definitely sci-fi, it's definitely horror, there's a lot of like really gross elements, there's a lot of suspenseful elements, there's a lot of, I want to say like bludgeoning and beating and blood, gory moments, but it's so good. As soon as I heard about Noir July, that was like, oh, I definitely want to read Molly Southbourne again. I got the audiobook from from Hoopla that is all 3 books. So I just renewed it today, actually. I am going to try and continue on with the series. I totally plan on getting these all physically and reading them again, all physically and reading them again and again. The next book that I finished in July is the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. This is one that as soon as Summerween was announced, I put it on hold on Libby, and my hold came in later in the month. This is the 3rd Grady Hendrix that I've read. I've read 2 short stories by Grady Hendrix, but this is the first full-length novel that I've read, and I had really, really, really high hopes for this one, and it disappointed me quite a bit. The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires is about a small southern town, somewhere in Georgia, maybe South Carolina. It's set in the 70s, I think. Yeah, definitely in the 70s. And it is about a group of housewives who have a book club. In the very first chapter, we find out about a book club that they had where they're reading like world literature, but it's all really boring and nobody wants to read it. And so some of these women break off a kind of out of the more traditional society and start reading true crime books and start reading smut and start reading different things like that and form this book club. And as they form this book club, they start to forge real friendships. And there's all these different personalities. Our main character is pretty timid with her husband and with her children. She like loves them a lot, and she is a stay-at-home wife, and she tries to do all the things right for her husband, for her kids, and tries to be fulfilled by this. But we see that like through these things that she's not as fulfilled as she could be, that her husband is not cool, that her kids are annoying to her, and that sometimes she would rather be at the book club or zoning out. The whole catalyst of this is one day in this kind of gated community, a new person arrives and weird things start happening, and our main character is unintentionally kind of thrust into this man's life. She's trying to do all the southern things that she's supposed to do, you know, even though he seems like an odd character, she goes over there with fake goods or whatever, and like all these weird things keep happening, and she just keeps trying to be this traditional housewife figure this whole time. But the more that weird things are happening, the more she is unable to deny that they are happening and that she needs to do something about it, because like if traditional means are used, like nothing's ever going to get better. So this is a horror, and there is some social justice horror involved in this, because one of the bad things that we see happening are happening to people on like the bad side of town, on the black side of town, and our main character one of her great assets is that she is incredibly empathetic. Instead of disregarding the Black people, instead of disregarding their story, instead of disregarding their pain, she sees that they're the same as she is and that she should be helping them as well. But when things start to get kind of too real for her and her family's involved, she abandons them. We skip through time, and then we kind of see her later again realizing that she should have done something then and that she needs to do something now. I didn't like this book. I thought it was really long. I thought it took an incredibly long time to get to the point. I liked our main character and I liked the journey that she went through, but it was so drawn out. I don't know. It seemed like almost like torture porn of being gaslighted and being ignored and being oppressed and being made to be traditional when you know that that's not the right thing to do. I get that you had to go on a journey with her, and I get that she needed certain things to happen to her to grow, but it was like 70% of the book that we had to go on that journey. Like, you know pretty much what's going to happen the whole time, and you are rooting for her because she is a good person, because she is an empathetic person. You are hoping that she's going to wake up. You are hoping that she's going to go back to the thing that she wanted to do originally and help other people. You hope that her friends are going to go with her, and you want that to happen, and you know some of them aren't, and you know some of them are, and you know some of them are going to change their minds at the last minute. But like, it just happened over and over and over again, and it was just so annoying and obnoxious. Like, I don't want to read 70% of a book of a woman being gaslighted to the point of like people getting hurt and killed, you know. Like, I don't want to read about people discounting women's opinions for that long. Like, it just seemed very unnecessary. And then in the last 30% of the book, all this action happens and all these things happen, and that's when people change their minds. And it just was so drawn out in the first part. This book could have been a shorter book, could have been a novella. This book could have been a more in-depth character study of these people. We could have learned more about their lives. We could have learned more in that time of what was going on in the town, but we really didn't. It was just men being obnoxious and women rolling over and taking it for 70% of the book, when you really only needed that to be like a setup, an initial part of the book. And then the outcome like was fine, and it was interesting, and there were certain aspects of the outcome that I did like, and I liked the way that certain people participated in the outcome and the way certain people didn't participate in the outcome, but it was just too drawn out, and there was just too much of the former to enjoy the latter. So I was really disappointed. This was on one of my like earliest booktube lists. Like, I found out about this the first year in booktube. I was so excited about it. I love a vampire book. I love a friends coming together book, but this just was not it. The next book that I finished in July was The Most by Jessica Anthony. I didn't realize it was so short when I first picked it up. This is another kind of domestic book, and it is about a woman and her husband and her kids, and one day the husband gets up to go to church with the kids. They're living in Delaware. They just moved there from like Connecticut or somewhere for her husband to get a new job and for her husband to start working there, and they're living kind of farther away in Delaware than they want from his job, so the husband goes kind of a long way to go to church, and this is the first time since they started going to church that the wife doesn't go to church. So we see our wife, does she have a name? Kathleen, from the husband's perspective first, and he's like, oh, you know, she's not feeling well, like, we'll go to church without her. He takes the boys to church. And then we see chapters from Kathleen's perspective and what she's doing at this very same time. So we see the scene from two different sides, but because the scenes diverge, it keeps it interesting, it keeps it fresh. And we learn about why Kathleen isn't feeling well, and as we learn about these two characters, we learn about their relationship and what their relationship has been and what their life is like, and kind of the, I think, pivotal moment of this book and of the synopsis of this book that people always talk about is that it's unseasonably warm for the fall, and Kathleen decides to get in the pool of the apartment complex that they are in, and she stays in the pool, and she stays in the pool when her husband comes back, and she stays in the pool longer than that, and we learn more about their lives through the interaction of Kathleen and her husband. So I thought this one was really interesting. I did really enjoy it. It was a lot more like domestic than I thought it was going to be, and I think, like I said, the synopsis talks about Kathleen staying in the pool, makes it like about the pool. It's not about the pool. It's about Kathleen and her actions and what the pool means to her and what the pool means to her actions. But it's not about the pool. Like, I thought this was going to be like a weird book, like a weird pool book where she like lives in a pool. That's not what this book is about. So I think it is a little bit like mismarketed in that respect. I think it's worth saying that she's in the pool because that is like a pivotal moment. But this is really a relationship book. This book reminded me a little bit of On Chisel Beach, in the idea that we have these people who are married, these people who have a relationship, these people who seemingly like know each other, and the dynamic between men and women in general in the foreground of this story. But the more that you learn about this relationship, the more that you learn about these people, you realize they don't really know each other at all. They don't really understand each other. Whereas On Chisel Beach is more about the rupture of that relationship and of those people. I think the most is a little bit more about the potential reuniting of these people and their emotions and their feelings towards each other and what they may or may not do, and this turning point, this tipping point in their relationship and where they could go from there. On Chisel Beach was like so depressing because it was so much about the complete lack of understanding of people, whereas this one was a little bit more hopeful in the potential understanding between people. So I did like this one a lot. I would like to maybe read this one again physically, although honestly the domestic stuff is just like not doing it for me lately, especially the straight heteronormative cis communication between man and woman is like, I find it to be like kind of boring and kind of frustrating a lot of the time. Like I said, I like this one. I like the way it was written. I have another Jessica Anthony book. I definitely plan on reading more by this author. I would like to see her do something else that's a little bit more non-traditional, I guess. I did really like aspects of this book, but I don't know. Maybe I wouldn't read this one again. I read this on audio. It was really good on audio. It was super quick, easy to get through, great one to read all in one day. I would highly recommend it, especially if you don't mind those domestic things. We'll find out at the end of the year if I'm going to keep this one or not. The last book that I finished was Small Favors by Wanda Morris, and this was a very short story that I get with one of my subscriptions. I haven't gotten rid of that subscription yet. I really need to do that. I need to do it. Small Favors is about a woman who is a trad wife who is living with her husband. Her husband is gaslighting her. Her husband turned from being like overly affectionate and wonderful and nice to being completely domineering and abusive and restrictive. She's kind of in the space where people around her are telling her that that's not okay, that her sister has tried to get her out, but she's not fully believing and understanding that she's in this terrible predicament and this terrible abusive relationship. She knows that she's not happy in her relationship, and she knows her husband's kind of a jerk, but she still holds out hope for that romantic guy that she first married. She still holds out hope that things will get better. She still sees herself as part of the problem. And the one thing that kind of keeps her going is that she makes jewelry, and she has a little shed out back, and she uses the shed to make the jewelry, and she sells the jewelry. But like, she can't tell her husband that she sells the jewelry. Even though she only uses that money to make more jewelry, she can't let him know that she's making her own money because he would take it away from her, because he would abuse her. Then something happens where he is pushed to a point where he is going to start taking things away from her, and she is pushed to the point where she has to do something about it. So that's the basic premise of the story, and I kind of hated it. I think coming off of Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires and that gaslighting of women, that abuse of women, that control of women, that lack of autonomy of women was not the right time for me to read this one, certainly. And it was just like the majority of the book was about that. Even though this is a very short story, it was only like 45 minutes or something on audio. I did read this one on audio as well. I was like, I don't care. I almost DNF'd it, but then I only had like 5-10 minutes left on the advanced speed, so I just listened to it. And it's fine. Obviously, it's part of the series that is about people getting their comeuppance and about justice of some sort or another kind of being done. So you can kind of imagine what happens at the end of this one, but Yeah, I really didn't like it. I don't know if I would read Wanda Morris again. I mean, the writing was like, okay. I just think if she's going to be writing domestic thrillers, I'm not really that interested. So those were all the books that I read in July. I read so many. I read so much for Summerween. I read a lot of horror and horror adjacent mystery things. I had 2 rereads this month for that. I finally finished a collection of short stories. I read another book that I hated. Now that I'm thinking about it, I had quite a few books this month that I definitely did not like. Keep that in mind. But I had a lot of books that I really, really enjoyed as well. I had a lot of mysteries that I liked. I had books that surprised me in how they were written or what kind of story they were telling. I had books that I could see myself going on to read other of the author. I finished books like MIddlegame and the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires that have been on my TBR forever. And I've also finished books that I've had on my shelves for a really long time. I read a graphic novel. I finished 2 of my TBR spin books. And then I read like a holdover from June. I read some queer work. I read some works by people of color. I read quite a bit of translated work this month, which is awesome because I have been wanting to read more translated work. Even though I had quite a few flops, like even though I had quite a few books I didn't like, overall this was a great reading month. I read 18 books and I feel really good about it. I read a little bit for Noir July, which is a spin-off continuation prologue to Blackoween, which is a very complicated readathon by Locked Booktition. I never got to participate in that one because it's so complicated, so it was nice to have an excuse to read for Noir July. I read for Summerween, which I love to read for every year. I read a ton of mysteries, which I was just super in the mood for. I read 1 book for PI July. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here. Let me know what you thought of them, especially the books that I didn't like. Like, I would love to hear your opinion on the books that I didn't like. Change my mind. Tell me something you liked about them so I can feel a little better about them. I would love to hear about the books that I like that you didn't like. And thanks so much for joining me today. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.